I finished with the healing of the man lowered from the roof. The next event in Matthew is that Levi is called. I'm going to call him Matthew Levi because he is a Levite, so that would be like his family name, Matthew the Levite. They go to his house and they have a meal, and then in Matthew it records that the disciples of John ask him, why do they, and also the Pharisees, fast, and yet Jesus and Jesus' disciples don't fast? And here Jesus responds, new wine in new wineskins versus the old wine in old wineskins. And it says, while he spoke these things, there came a ruler who worshipped him, saying, my daughter is now dead. This is Jairus, or Jairus. This event of the ruler coming to Jesus, asking for him to heal his daughter, and then on his way, the woman with the issue of blood being healed, that happens later on in Mark and in Luke. The question of fasting, which happens during this meal, does happen right here in Mark and Luke, immediately after Levi is called. The question of fasting, which happens during this meal, does happen right here in Mark and Luke, immediately after Levi is called. The first question is, where is this event of Jesus being called by the ruler? Is it now or is it later? So when you're looking at Luke, a big hint is that immediately after Jesus calls Matthew Levi, it says, he made a great feast. It only says the scribes and the Pharisees asked him, why do you eat with sinners and publicans? And then later on, then they, the scribes and the Pharisees, they said to him, why do the disciples of John fast often? So these are the scribes and the Pharisees asking Jesus the question, and they're also mentioning, not only do we do this, but the disciples of John do this. That's the real difference. In Mark, it says, when the scribes and the Pharisees saw him eat with publicans and sinners, they said to his disciples, how is it that he eats and drinks with publicans and sinners? Then it says, and the disciples of John and the Pharisees used to fast, and they came to him and said, why do the disciples of John and the Pharisees fast? And he responds. So it makes more sense that there are two different events that he's asked about fasting. In Matthew, the disciples of John are asking Jesus about fasting. In Luke, it says the scribes and the Pharisees are asking Jesus about fasting. In Mark, it says both. Actually, Mark doesn't totally say both. It says in Mark 2:16, when the scribes and the Pharisees saw him eat with publicans and sinners, they said to his disciples. Verse 18 says, the disciples of John and of the Pharisees used to fast, and they came and said to him. So this they from Mark 2:18, they come and say to him. That could be talking about who was just mentioned in the sentence before at the beginning of verse 18, the disciples of John and of the Pharisees. Or it could be referring to who was already speaking before in verse 16, the scribes and the Pharisees, who were asking the question the first time. I think that actually makes a bit more sense than that both the scribes and the Pharisees and the disciples of John now were there asking Jesus the question. The event from Matthew of the disciples of John does happen later, which means that here in Mark, it's probably the same incident as recorded in Luke. It's just the scribes and the Pharisees asking the question and remarking how the disciples of John are also doing the same. His response in both Matthew and Luke is the same, but again, the reason why these are most likely different events is because in Matthew it says immediately while he's responding, the ruler comes to him and asks him to heal his daughter, and he does go. And on the way, the woman is healed of the blood. And that event happens one chapter later in Luke. And there are other events that happen before that, which are recorded in Matthew and Mark. That makes it pretty easy to say the questioning of Jesus by the disciples of John and Matthew is different from as it's recorded in Mark and Luke. Because the end of Jesus' response to this question, at verse 18, it's saying, while he spoke these things to them, behold, there came a certain ruler who worshipped him, saying, my daughter is now dead. Come and lay your hand upon her, and she shall live. Because clearly this also says that the disciples of John came to him, whereas in Mark and Luke it only said that they asked and mentioned the disciples of John. Those two hints make it so that this is probably a different event. So I'm going to have included here this question from Mark and Luke, where the scribes and the Pharisees are asking him the question, and later I'll put in the question from only the disciples of John. I'm going to push this portion in Matthew later on until after the exorcism of the Gadarene demoniac. I'm just going to record the question from Mark and Luke because it's from the Pharisees. It's the same question, and Jesus' response is the same. He's talking about the bridegroom is with them and they will not fast now. And then new wine goes into new wineskins, old wine goes into old wineskins. This one verse at the very end of 18, while he spoke these things, Jairus came up to him, which means this is a different event, this is later. And also, John's disciples are asking him there, where they're not there in Mark and Luke. I could repeat this again and again. I don't really like that the same question, even if it's most likely by different people, and Jesus' same response is being separated, or at least it looks like it's being separated according to the timeline, into two different questions. But if I don't do that, that would mean that I would have to take this verse, Matthew 9:18, while he spoke these things to them, I would have to put that verse way later after something else that Jesus spoke, so that it's in line with the timeline from Mark and Luke of when Jairus actually did ask him, which means that I would pretty much be lying about what this verse is talking about in saying while Jesus spoke these things. It would be as if I'm saying Jesus was actually talking about something else. I would be much more comfortable in saying this is a different event, as Michael Rood sees it as well, than saying no, it's the same event and verse 18 is just wrong. It says while he spoke these things, but the verse is wrong. I don't feel comfortable saying this verse is wrong. I would much rather say it's a different event. The events that happen right after that in Matthew, saying while he said these things, Jairus the ruler comes and asks him to heal his daughter, and then on his way the woman is healed with blood. That definitely happens later on in Luke. In Luke it says that event happens after he arrives back in his hometown, and then it's unclear about when that actually happens. So that's the perfect place to put those events. This is Luke 8, right after he heals the Gadarene demoniac. Then verse 40, it came to pass that when Jesus was returned, the people gladly received him, for they were all waiting for him. And then verse 41, and behold, there came a man named Jairus. So it doesn't say this happened immediately. This could be a little bit of time later, which is perfect for the disciples of John to arrive because that's his hometown, and that's where the disciples of John found him. They ask him the question, and then while he's answering the question, this man arrives. Verse 41, there came a man named Jairus, and it continues on with the story. There's another possibility of how this question can be answered. The two questions of fasting. Maybe they are just one. For a lot of other people who have done a similar project, in order to keep this question combined as one, because it is very similar, because Jesus' response is the same, they will separate Jesus' calling of Matthew from Matthew hosting a meal for Jesus with publicans and sinners. Even though in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of the Gospels where this story is recorded, it goes right into the meal that Matthew hosts immediately after Matthew is called. That alone should be enough reason not to go for that answer. But I can understand the need, the desire to do so, because of the phrasing that while Jesus spoke on these things, talking about fasting, Jairus arrived. And yet in Mark and Luke, Jairus arrived later. The question was earlier. So if you moved the meal that Jesus was eating with publicans and sinners to just before Jairus arrived, and they go to heal Jairus' daughter, then you could say that both of these questions of fasting were actually just one question of fasting. The scribes and the Pharisees asked him, and then maybe also the disciples of John the Baptist were there asking him the question. Jesus responds, and then during that response, Jairus arrives. And all that would need to be done is that you separate the calling of Matthew with the meal that Matthew hosts for Jesus. But again, like I said, it doesn't go that way in Matthew or Mark or Luke. All three of the Gospels have Matthew called, and the very next event is that Matthew hosts a meal for Jesus. So I'm going to go with Matthew, Mark, and Luke over anyone else's interpretation. I would much rather say, as the questions are coming from different people, that the questions are at two different times. And he responds to this question twice. Once where it says in Matthew, and once where it says in Mark and Luke. That's pretty simple. I'm going to stick with that. So, because of that, then I can write, he's inviting Levi, Matthew Levi, as recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But then when it gets to the question of Matthew 9, verse 14, all the way down to he's going to heal the daughter, he heals the woman with the issue of blood, 2 blind men, the man who couldn't speak. He goes through all the cities and villages, all of these until verse 34, 35. All of that I can put later. After all those events that I'm skipping and moving later, he names the 12 disciples, which does happen right after going through the wheat fields, heals a man with the withered hand, and then he ordains 12. So that's the order. And just this one section, chapter 9, verse 14 to maybe 35, 36, I'm not exactly sure where, is just going to be pushed way later. So I'm going to start with chapter 9, verse 9. He passed forth from there, saw a man named Matthew Levi, and that's the same place where I'll continue in Mark and Luke. So in Mark, it is 2, verse 13, and he went forth again by the seaside, and all the multitudes resorted to him, and he taught them, and he passed by. He saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the receipt of custom, and he calls him. Luke 5:27. And after these things, he went forth and saw a publican named Levi. So that's the 3 places where I'm going to begin now. I'm going to stop before the question, Matthew. So, how to begin?